They had told her from the very beginning that she wasn't built for war, that a woman with her slight frame and quiet eyes would crumble the first time bullets cracked the air and bodies dropped around her. But those voices had only hardened into the echo of doubt that she carried with her into the valley where the enemy was already waiting. The sun was setting behind the jagged ridgeline, painting the rocks in blood-colored light, and she lay prone against the earth with her cheek pressed to the wooden stock of her rifle, listening to the whispers of the wind and the distant shuffle of boots approaching. Her unit had been scattered in the ambush, radio calls dissolving into static, screams and sudden silence, leaving her alone with only 2 magazines, a canteen of water, and the pounding of her own heart to remind her that she was still alive. Fear should have drowned her then, should have made her curl into the dirt and pray for it to end, but instead she felt a cold, burning clarity washing through her veins, the kind that sharpened her focus until the dust motes in the air seemed to hang motionless and every breath slid into rhythm with the beat of the trigger beneath her finger. She remembered the voices from camp, the mocking laughter, the dismissive shrugs of seasoned men who believed she would freeze the first time a muzzle flash lit the darkness, and she almost smiled because in that moment she realized the only way to silence them forever was not to argue, not to prove herself in words, but to paint her answer in fire and steel. The first shapes appeared through the wavering heat, shadows moving across the rocks, rifles slung casually as if the ambush had been so decisive that no one could possibly have survived, and she let them come closer, counting their steps, measuring the rhythm of their march until they were no longer silhouettes but faces, hard and scarred, eyes sweeping lazily over the terrain. She exhaled and squeezed, and the crack of the shot tore through the evening, one man collapsing before he even understood what had happened, his helmet rolling away as his comrades ducked for cover, shouts rising like sparks in the wind. The second shot came as naturally as a blink, dropping another figure before the rest could find the angle of her fire, and then chaos erupted as they scrambled behind rocks and shouted commands in a language she didn't need to understand to recognize fear. She shifted positions, rolling onto her side and sliding down into a new nest before they could triangulate her, each movement fluid from months of training, each decision born not from panic but from a fierce determination that she would not end here in some nameless valley as a forgotten casualty. They pushed forward, trying to flank her, but she anticipated their paths, her mind mapping the terrain as if she had been born from the dust itself, and one by one they fell, each shot an act of defiance, each spent casing a reminder that she was still standing when they had believed she would break. The smell of gunpowder clung to her hands, the recoil bruised her shoulder, but there was no room for hesitation, only the relentless rhythm of fire and reload, until she lost count of how many bodies lay sprawled in the dirt, their weapons silent, their momentum broken. She heard them shouting now with anger instead of confidence, calling for reinforcements, voices cracking in disbelief that one soldier, one woman, could hold them at bay. Sweat dripped into her eyes but she blinked it away, steadying her breathing as the sky deepened into night and the shadows thickened, giving her more cover to move like a ghost through the rocks, striking from angles they never expected. 4 hours it continued, surges of attackers trying to overwhelm her position, and for hours she answered them with the calm persistence of a force far greater than her single body, her rifle an extension of her will, her heartbeat a drum guiding her through the storm. When her last magazine ran dry and the echoes of the final volley faded into the silence of the valley, 200 enemies had fallen, their advance shattered, their pride buried beneath the dust, and she was still standing, bloodied, exhausted, but unbroken, the doubts of the world lying dead alongside those who had believed she would be nothing more than another casualty of war. Her breath came ragged in the aftermath, lungs burning from the dust and smoke, yet her grip on the rifle never loosened, as though the weapon itself had fused into her arm, as though she and the steel were one body forged by fire and necessity. But as silence stretched across the valley she knew it was not the end, because battles of this scale never ended in silence, only in echoes that drew in more men, more machines, more death. She crouched low and pressed her back to the cool stone of a boulder, forcing herself to drink sparingly from the canteen, tasting metal and grit on her tongue, knowing that exhaustion could not be allowed to claim her because survival belonged to those who refused to surrender to the weight of fatigue. The bodies around her were evidence of what she had achieved, 200 enemies sprawled in broken heaps, their rifles dark against the fading light, but she dared not feel triumph, because pride was a dangerous luxury on the battlefield, one that blinded soldiers to the danger still stalking the edges of night. From the ridge above came the hum of engines, faint at first, like insects in the distance, but then swelling into the unmistakable sound of armored transports crawling toward the valley, and with them the shouted orders of commanders determined to avenge the humiliation of their slaughtered men. She wiped her forehead with the back of her sleeve, smearing sweat and dust into streaks, her muscles trembling from hours of relentless combat, yet beneath the trembling was a core of iron that had only grown harder with each trigger pull, each decision made in the face of impossible odds. The memory of her comrades flickered in her mind, their laughter at the campfire, the smell of cheap coffee brewing at dawn, the voices that had fallen silent in the ambush, and she felt a surge of anger that banished her fatigue, a vow forming in her chest that she would not allow their deaths to be meaningless. She scavenged quickly, moving from body to body, stripping ammunition from fallen rifles, her hands swift and practiced as she reloaded, her ears straining for every shift of gravel, every rustle of boots climbing the slope. The night deepened, stars igniting in the sky above like cold watchers, but down in the valley the darkness seemed alive, crawling with movement, enemy patrols sweeping with flashlights, beams of pale light cutting across the rocks as they searched for the phantom who had turned their comrades into corpses. She lay flat, pressing her body into the earth, letting the stones bite into her skin as the lights passed only feet away, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would give her away, but the soldiers moved on, muttering curses and dragging their dead into piles, their anger thick enough to taste in the air. She knew they would not stop, that vengeance was a hunger without end, and that soon they would tighten the noose around the valley until there was no escape. Still, she refused to retreat because something deeper than orders or pride anchored her to that ground, something born from the moment she squeezed the first trigger and realized that fear no longer ruled her. She shifted her position higher up the slope, dragging herself silently from shadow to shadow, until she could see the glimmer of their vehicles parked in a line, armored hulks bristling with weapons, soldiers gathered around them like vultures preparing for the next strike. Her hands tightened on the rifle as a thought rose unbidden. If she could cripple their machines, stall their momentum, she might buy enough time for distant allies to regroup, maybe even enough for her own survival. Crawling closer, she felt every pebble grind into her elbows, every scrape sting against her knees, but she did not stop, moving like a shadow until she had the angle she needed. The first shot tore through the night, shattering the windshield of the lead vehicle, the driver slumping forward in a spray of glass, and chaos erupted once more as men scrambled for cover, shouting in disbelief that the lone phantom still haunted them. She fired again and a fuel tank burst into flame, a tower of orange fire clawing upward, the explosion rocking the ground beneath her. They returned fire, bullets slashing the air, sparks flying from the rocks around her, but she rolled, slid down into another crevice, and re-emerged from a different angle, striking again and again until the valley echoed with fire and thunder, until the once calm night was lit like a battlefield of hell. She could feel her arms shaking now, the strain of hours of combat dragging at her muscles, but adrenaline drove her forward, the raw refusal to surrender keeping her body moving when reason said she should have collapsed long ago. She was no longer simply a soldier in that valley, she had become something else, something the enemy whispered about in fear, a relentless figure that emerged from the dark to strike and vanish, a ghost with iron in her veins and fire in her hands. By the time the last explosion faded and the burning vehicles painted the valley in flickering red light, the survivors had fled back into the shadows, too shaken to continue their advance, leaving her once more alone with the echo of her rifle and the silence that followed. She dropped back against the rocks, chest heaving, her eyes scanning the destruction she had wrought, and though her body begged her to close her eyes and surrender to sleep, her mind remained clear and sharp, already calculating, already bracing for the storm that would inevitably come again. The smoke from the burning vehicles drifted upward into the star-strewn sky, thick and acrid, stinging her lungs as she breathed it in, but she did not move from her perch, her rifle balanced across her knees, eyes scanning the shifting glow for the next wave she knew would come, because men who had already lost so much would not retreat forever, pride would drag them back into the fire even if fear clawed at their throats, and so she waited, every nerve taut, every sound magnified by the silence between bursts of crackling flames. Somewhere in the distance a wounded soldier cried out, his voice echoing across the rocks before cutting off abruptly, and she wondered whether mercy had been delivered by a comrade's bullet or whether the desert itself had claimed him, but such questions had no place in her mind, not now when her own survival demanded that she silence every distraction, every flicker of pity or doubt. Her canteen was nearly empty, the few mouthfuls of water left sloshing faintly as she shook it, and her stomach twisted in hunger, but she ignored both, for she had long ago learned that war was not fought on a full belly or in comfort, but in the moments when your body screamed for rest and you forced it into silence, when pain became a background hum drowned out by the sharper call of duty. Crawling from shadow to shadow, she circled the wreckage, careful not to silhouette herself against the firelight, her senses stretched thin, listening for the telltale scrape of boots or the metallic click of a weapon being readied, but the valley was eerily quiet, as though even the enemy had recoiled at the fury she had unleashed. For a heartbeat she allowed herself to think of home, of the green hills far from this barren battlefield, of her mother's hands kneading bread at dawn and her father's laughter echoing across the porch, and the memory tightened her chest with a pang so sharp it threatened to undo her, but she gritted her teeth and forced it back into the shadows of her mind, because home was a place she might never see again, and dwelling on it now would only weaken her resolve. She reminded herself that she was here for them, for the fallen comrades whose blood stained the rocks, for the innocent who would suffer if the enemy advanced unchecked, and in that reminder she found the strength to keep her eyes open and her fingers steady on the trigger. Hours dragged by, the stars shifting in their slow march across the heavens, the fire dwindling into embers, until at last movement stirred at the far edge of the valley, figures creeping low, dozens of them, their silhouettes dark against the dim horizon, advancing cautiously as though afraid the ghost of the valley would rise again to meet them. She raised her rifle, lined up her sights and waited, her breath shallow, her body still, but then she noticed something different in their formation. They were spread wide, deliberate, their advance slower but measured, and she realized these were not the panicked remnants of a broken force but a fresh unit, reinforcements sent to finish what the others had failed to do. The thought should have crushed her, the knowledge that she was only one against many, but instead it ignited a fire in her chest, a stubborn defiance that whispered if she was to die here then she would make the valley remember her forever, her name carried in the smoke and ash of those who thought her weak. The first man fell to her shot before the others even knew she was there, his cry silenced mid-breath, and then the valley erupted once more in chaos, bullets sparking against stone as the enemy dove for cover, voices rising in urgent commands. She shifted, crawled, fired again, her body moving on instinct honed by hours of survival, every muscle aching yet still obeying, every nerve burning yet still pushing forward. Grenades arced through the air, exploding in thunderous bursts that shook the rocks, fragments whistling past her ears, but she ducked and rolled, her mind clear even as her body screamed, and when the dust settled she rose to strike again, her rifle spitting defiance into the night. One fell, then another, her movements weaving a deadly rhythm that turned the valley into a graveyard of ambition, and though she knew her ammunition was dwindling, though she felt the weight of each bullet spent, she also felt the strange calm of purpose settling over her, the certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, in this crucible of fire and death where doubt had no foothold. The enemy pressed harder, anger and desperation driving them forward, but she matched them with sheer will, her body a storm of motion, her rifle a voice of thunder that spoke only of resistance, and when dawn finally broke over the ridgeline, painting the valley in pale light, the ground was littered with bodies once more, their assault broken against the unyielding figure of the woman they had sworn would break. The first rays of sunlight bled across the horizon, gilding the jagged peaks in cold fire and casting long shadows over the valley that was now a graveyard, the air heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid bite of smoke, yet she did not let her rifle rest, because she knew that sunlight did not mean safety, it only meant her enemies could see her more clearly, and clarity was both shield and curse on a battlefield such as this. Her body trembled from exhaustion, every muscle raw and screaming, her lips cracked from thirst, her fingers bruised from gripping steel through endless hours of recoil, but her spirit was unbroken, sharpened by the knowledge that she had already survived what no one believed possible, that she had already stood against impossible odds and remained standing, though the cost of that defiance was etched in every ache and bruise, in every phantom echo of the fallen voices that still haunted her. She crouched in the shadow of a rock, studying the horizon, where dust plumes rose faintly in the distance, betraying the approach of yet more reinforcements, a relentless tide that seemed determined to swallow her whole, and she realized that the enemy could not allow her survival, not now, not after so many had died beneath her rifle, because to let her live would be to admit that all their strength and numbers were meaningless against the will of one unyielding soul. She dragged herself across the dirt, scavenging again, prying weapons from limp hands, collecting what little ammunition remained, and though each step sent knives of pain through her legs, she did not stop, because stopping was death, and death was not something she intended to offer freely. As she worked, she thought of the stories that might already be forming somewhere beyond this valley, whispered tales of a lone woman who refused to fall, of an unbreakable spirit who turned a battlefield into a testament of resistance, and the thought carried her forward, not out of vanity but because she wanted her fallen comrades to be remembered through her fight, their courage carried in her defiance. The sound of engines grew louder, the rhythm of boots on stone a drumbeat of inevitability, and soon the ridgeline swarmed with fresh troops, their ranks disciplined, their formation tight, not the chaotic rush of desperate men but the measured advance of soldiers sent to crush a legend before it could spread. She steadied her breathing, adjusted her grip, and waited, watching as they descended in coordinated waves, rifles ready, armor gleaming beneath the sun, their officers shouting commands with the confidence of those who believed sheer numbers would guarantee victory. But numbers had already failed here, and she intended to remind them of it. Her first shot rang out, precise, dropping an officer mid-command, his body tumbling into the dust as confusion rippled through the ranks, and then she struck again and again, shifting positions with the speed of instinct, her rifle barking like thunder across the rocks. The enemy responded with a hail of fire, bullets slicing the air, ricochets sparking against stone, the roar of machine guns drowning the morning silence, but she moved like a shadow, slipping between cover, returning fire with cold precision, each shot placed with the calm certainty of a soldier who had accepted that every bullet must count. Explosions tore chunks of earth into the sky as mortars rained down, the shock waves slamming against her chest, filling her ears with a roar that drowned thought, but she gritted her teeth and crawled through the debris, emerging from the smoke to strike again, her rifle cutting down those who dared push closer. Time lost meaning in that maelstrom, minutes stretching into eternities as wave after wave hurled itself into the valley, and still she stood, battered, bloodied, yet unbroken, her determination a wall they could not breach. When at last the gunfire faltered and the smoke thinned, the valley was once again littered with fallen bodies, their formations shattered, their machines burning, and she stood in the midst of it all like a figure carved from stone, her chest heaving, her hands trembling but still wrapped around her rifle, her eyes burning with a fire that no exhaustion could extinguish. The survivors pulled back, dragging their wounded, their once proud advance reduced to retreat beneath the gaze of a single woman who refused to yield, and she knew then that even if she fell in the next hour, even if her body finally gave in to the weight of battle, she had already carved her defiance into the earth, already proven that the voices who doubted her had been wrong. That strength was not measured by size or by gender but by the unbreakable will to stand when everything else demanded you fall. Her body felt heavier than the stone she crouched behind, each limb weighed down by exhaustion that clawed at her bones, yet when she looked out over the valley she refused to see herself as a woman at the edge of collapse. She saw herself as a wall that would not fall no matter how many waves battered against it, and that conviction carried her even as her vision blurred at the edges and her breath rasped like sandpaper in her throat. The sun climbed higher, its heat pressing down like a suffocating hand, baking the blood into the rocks, thickening the stench of gunpowder and decay until the air itself seemed to choke with death, but she ignored the discomfort, forcing her mind into the same cold clarity that had carried her through the long night, reminding herself that as long as she could still breathe, as long as her finger could still pull the trigger, she had the power to deny her enemies the victory they hungered for. From the ridges came new movement, a line of armored vehicles descending slowly, their engines growling like predators, the soldiers marching beside them disciplined, their faces hidden behind visors that reflected the glare of the sun, and for the first time she realized they were no longer underestimating her, they were approaching as if facing an equal force, the respect of fear shaping their every step. She slid into a new position, her rifle steady, and waited until they were close enough that hesitation would mean nothing, then she fired, the crack splitting the morning air as a soldier toppled, his comrades scattering behind the armored wall, returning fire in disciplined bursts. Bullets slammed against stone around her, chips of rock stinging her face, but she rolled, crawled, shifted higher up the slope, using the terrain like an ally, her body screaming in protest but still obeying, because she knew survival was not about comfort but about refusing to stop even when every part of you demanded surrender. She aimed for weak points, firing into slits, striking tires, aiming at exposed joints, each shot calculated not just to kill but to cripple, to sap momentum, and soon one vehicle shuddered to a halt, smoke spilling from its engine, its crew scrambling out only to be cut down in the storm of her fire. The enemy responded with rockets, the blasts shaking the ground beneath her, the air filling with fire and dust, but she crawled through the chaos, her lungs burning, her ears ringing, and rose to fire again, her silhouette a fleeting phantom against the smoke. Every shot was an act of defiance, every movement a refusal to be cornered, and though her arms shook with fatigue, though her shoulders ached with each recoil, she pressed on, because in her mind the battle was no longer just for survival but for the principle that no soul should be dismissed as weak before they had been tested. Minutes bled into hours, the battle dragging across the valley like a storm that refused to pass, and all the while she endured, her will unbroken even as her body faltered, until at last the enemy broke formation, retreating once more in disarray, their machines burning, their soldiers scattering into the ridges with fear gnawing at their pride. She lowered her rifle only when the silence returned, her chest heaving, sweat and blood streaking her face, her vision swimming from exhaustion, and she thought, not for the first time, that perhaps she was living on borrowed time, that perhaps her body had already given more than it should, but then she remembered the voices that had doubted her, the comrades who had fallen believing she could never endure, and she clenched her jaw and swore that she would continue as long as breath filled her lungs. She sat against the rocks, cradling her rifle like a child, staring out at the valley littered with twisted steel and broken bodies, and though she felt the tremor of fear creep into her chest at the thought of yet another wave to come, she pushed it down and whispered into the silence that she would not break, not now, not ever, because breaking was what they expected, and her entire existence had become the denial of their expectations. The silence that hung over the valley after the retreat felt unnatural, not like peace but like the pause of a predator circling unseen, and though her body screamed for rest she forced herself to stay alert, eyes narrowed, fingers wrapped tightly around her rifle, because she knew the enemy had not given up, they were regrouping, recalculating, preparing to descend again with a fury sharpened by humiliation, and she had to be ready to meet them no matter the cost. The sky above had shifted to a harsh blue, the sun blazing without mercy, baking her skin until it felt raw, her lips cracked and bleeding from thirst, her body trembling with the weight of hours upon hours of battle, yet her spirit burned hotter than the sun, the same stubborn flame that had carried her through the night now carrying her through this endless day. She dragged herself higher up the slope, her movements slow but deliberate, each scrape of her boots and elbows carving new lines into the dirt, and when she reached a ledge that overlooked the valley she collapsed for a moment, pressing her cheek against the stone to cool the feverish heat in her face, but only for a heartbeat before she pushed herself up again, because rest was weakness and weakness could not be allowed. Below her the enemy began to stir once more, their formations tightening, their vehicles rolling into position, but this time she noticed something different. Banners raised, signals flaring, the unmistakable preparation for a full assault, the kind meant to crush resistance entirely, and she realized they no longer saw her as a nuisance or even as a threat. They saw her as a symbol, and symbols had to be destroyed publicly and absolutely. A shiver of fear ran through her, cold despite the sun's heat, but she gritted her teeth and anchored herself with the memory of her comrades, of their laughter silenced too soon, of the promises they had made to return home together, promises now carried only in her blood and bones, and she vowed she would not let their memory be erased. As the enemy advanced she opened fire, each shot precise, each kill deliberate, and though their numbers were overwhelming she struck with the ferocity of someone who had long since moved beyond fear, her rifle singing its deadly song, her movements a blur of instinct and will. They returned fire in a storm, the air tearing with bullets, explosions rocking the earth, dust clouds choking her vision, but she moved through it like a wraith, appearing where they least expected, vanishing before their retaliation could land, and with every enemy she felt the legend of the unbreakable woman grew. She was running low on ammunition now, the weight of each bullet left heavy in her mind, and she scavenged again, sprinting low across the battlefield to pry magazines from the dead, her lungs searing, her legs threatening to buckle, yet her determination dragging her onward. At one point a soldier rushed her position, his rifle raised, and she swung her weapon like a club, the stock cracking against his skull, sending him sprawling lifeless to the dirt, her breath ragged as she reloaded and returned to her relentless rhythm of fire and survival. The battle stretched on, hour bleeding into hour, the valley transformed into a furnace of blood and dust, and though the enemy pressed with endless waves she held them, her defiance turning every rock into a fortress, every shadow into cover, until even the most hardened among them hesitated before advancing. When the sun began to dip once more toward the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, she found herself still alive, still holding her ground, her rifle hot in her hands, her body battered but unbroken, and as the enemy withdrew once again, dragging their dead and wounded, she stood atop the ledge and stared after them, her silhouette framed by the dying light like a figure carved into legend. In that moment she felt the weight of everything she had endured pressing down on her shoulders, the exhaustion, the grief, the endless cycle of battle, but beneath it all was pride, not for herself alone but for the truth she had proven. That strength was not something given by others, it was something claimed in fire and blood, something no ridicule or doubt could ever erase, and she whispered into the wind that carried the scent of smoke and death that she would not stop, not until the valley itself remembered her name. The night had fallen heavier than before, and the only sound echoing through the valley was the dull crack of distant rifle fire, intermittent like the heartbeat of a dying beast. She crouched in the shadows of a half-shattered bunker, her hands tightening around the rifle that had never betrayed her, the weapon that had become more than just steel and wood, It had become her will, her voice, her shield against a world that wanted to erase her existence. Her breath was steady despite the exhaustion tugging at her muscles, and her mind sharpened with the same cold clarity that had carried her through every battle since the war began. Ahead of her stretched the enemy encampment, lit faintly by scattered torches and the flickering glow of campfires, their silhouettes moving restlessly, searching for her as though they were hunting a ghost. And perhaps to them she was nothing less than a phantom of vengeance, a shadow slipping through their lines, always one step ahead, always one bullet closer to thinning their ranks. She closed her eyes for a moment, recalling the faces of those who had doubted her back in her own camp, the commanders who whispered that she would break, the soldiers who pitied her for being placed in the storm of war. They had been wrong. Every pull of the trigger had proved them wrong. Every enemy who fell had carried their disbelief into the grave. And yet she was not fighting for recognition anymore. No, she fought for something deeper, something rawer. Fought for the village she had lost, for the cries of children silenced by flames, for the memory of her father who had placed a wooden practice rifle in her hands when she was barely old enough to stand. She fought for vengeance and for survival, but above all, she fought because surrender was a word that had no place in her blood. The rifle was warm in her grip, its magazine nearly full after her last careful reload. She studied the guards below, watching their careless laughter as though the war was nothing more than a distant story. She knew their arrogance. She had seen it before and she knew how to turn it against them. She moved like a whisper through the shadows, her boots sinking softly into the dirt, her form merging with the darkness. The first man never even saw her. The crack of her rifle was swallowed by the night as he collapsed silently into the earth. The second turned in confusion, his mouth opening, but the bullet reached his chest before sound could. Within moments, panic erupted in the camp. Shouts rang out, orders barked, rifles raised, but they fired into emptiness, into the shifting blackness where she had already moved on. She became the storm circling them, a single relentless predator among prey that believed itself mighty. Grenades arced through the air, explosions tearing through tents, sending fire licking into the sky, shadows jerking and twisting as chaos consumed order. Her rifle sang its deadly rhythm, precise and unerring, every shot striking with the inevitability of fate. They returned fire blindly, bullets snapping into trees and soil, but she was never where they aimed. She slid across the terrain, reloading with a calmness that seemed inhuman, her hands working from instinct forged in endless nights of survival. One by one they fell, and with every body that dropped, fear spread like a plague. She could see it in their frantic movements, their desperate retreat deeper into the encampment, their belief cracking under the weight of a truth they could no longer deny. She was not a soldier to underestimate. She was not a weak point in the line. She was the line itself, unbreakable and merciless. Hours bled into what felt like minutes, the battle stretching on with a fevered intensity until the ground was slick with the aftermath. Smoke rose into the night, flames devouring supplies, and the groans of the wounded mixed with the sharp cries of the dying. Still she pressed forward, her body a machine of endurance, her spirit unyielding. She felt the ache of her arms, the burning in her lungs, but she did not falter. Every drop of her strength was poured into this fight, and as the enemy numbers dwindled, she knew she was nearing the heart of the storm. A commander stepped into view, his uniform distinguished, his face twisted with fury and fear alike. He shouted orders, rallying the survivors, but his voice carried desperation more than power. She took aim, her finger resting on the trigger, and as the shot rang out, silence fell over the camp. The last true voice of command crumbled, and with him, so too did the will of his men. The survivors broke, fleeing into the darkness, abandoning weapons and comrades alike. She stood in the midst of the burning wreckage, her rifle held firm though her hands trembled from the sheer toll of it all. Around her lay the cost of her defiance, the proof of her resilience, the undeniable truth that she was no ordinary soldier. She was the flame that refused to die, the spirit that no enemy could crush. And as the dawn began to rise over the horizon, painting the battlefield with shades of pale light, she knew this was only one night in a war of many. But it was a night that would be remembered, whispered among enemies as the legend of the woman who would not break, no matter how many guns turned against her, no matter how many shadows closed in. The roar of battle faded slowly as the smoke drifted across the valley, and Alara stood among the shattered remains of the enemy line, her rifle heavy in her hands, its barrel scorched from relentless firing. Around her, the ground was littered with bodies, and though she had felled 200 enemies, it felt less like triumph and more like survival carved out of blood and fire. Her uniform was torn, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, but her eyes still burned with the determination that had carried her through when everyone else thought she would break. She moved slowly through the wreckage, searching for any sign of movement, her boots crunching on gravel and broken weapon parts, each step carrying the weight of the countless lives she had just ended. It was not glory she felt, nor pride, but a heavy, quiet acceptance of what had been demanded of her and what she had delivered. Behind her, the scattered remnants of her unit began to emerge, wounded but alive, staring at her as though she had become something more than human. None spoke, yet their silence carried a weight as great as their awe, and Alara only lowered her head, unwilling to bask in anything but the grim truth that she was still standing where many should have fallen. She moved to a collapsed wall and sank down, her hands trembling as she laid the rifle across her knees. She had fought harder, longer, and more fiercely than she ever believed she could, driven by the thought that surrender meant not just her death, but the death of those she had sworn to protect. The memory of her commander's final words, "Hold the line no matter the cost," still echoed in her mind, and she had answered that call with every bullet, every breath, every ounce of her strength. But now, in the silence that followed, the faces of the fallen enemies rose in her memory, flickering like ghosts in the smoke. She did not know their names, their lives, or what they had believed in, only that they had stood against her and she had cut them down. Her chest ached with the weight of it, but she reminded herself of the families hidden behind the ridge, the ones who would live another day because she had refused to break. Her hands curled into fists, and though she wanted to collapse into exhaustion, she forced herself to stay upright, to breathe, to remain unbroken even now. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention, and a figure appeared, Captain Darren, bloodied but alive, his arm bound with a rough bandage. His eyes fixed on her with something caught between disbelief and reverence. "You did it," he said hoarsely, as though speaking it aloud made it real. "You held them off, all of them." Alara shook her head, her voice rough when she finally spoke. "I didn't win. I just didn't die." But the captain would not let her diminish it. He knelt beside her, gripping her shoulder firmly. "You gave us a chance. That's more than anyone could have asked." His words struck her deeper than he knew, because in truth she had not fought for glory or recognition. She had fought because there was no one else left to stand when it mattered. That knowledge, raw and unadorned, was the only thing that kept her from breaking under the weight of what she had done. As the wounded were gathered and the survivors regrouped, word of Alara's stand spread quickly, whispered in awe among the soldiers and spoken with trembling voices among the refugees who learned of how one woman had held back an army. Yet Alara herself avoided their gaze, unable to meet their gratitude with anything but silence. She knew they saw her as a savior, but in her heart she still felt the blood on her hands. When night fell and the fires burned low, she sat alone beneath the shattered sky, staring at her rifle. It was empty now, its magazine spent, its barrel scorched, a silent testament to her defiance. She traced the dents along its surface, each one a reminder of the countless moments it had nearly failed, and each one a reminder that she had not. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes and breathe deeply, listening not to the echoes of gunfire but to the quiet sound of wind moving through the ruined valley. It was the first time in what felt like forever that she could hear something other than death. Dawn came slowly, painting the world in pale light, and with it came orders to move forward. Reinforcements had finally arrived, pushing back the remnants of the enemy with ease where she had once stood alone. As her unit prepared to march, Alara rose, her body aching with every movement, but her spirit unbroken. She strapped the rifle to her back, knowing she might never again fire it in such desperation, but also knowing that if the moment ever came again, she would not falter. Around her, soldiers whispered her name, some even reaching out to touch her arm as though she carried some untouchable strength, but Alara only looked ahead, her eyes hard, her expression steady. She was not invincible, not unbreakable, but she had proved to herself that when everything else collapsed, she could endure. And in that endurance, she had found something greater than victory, she had found herself. When they marched, she walked at the front, not by choice but because the others fell in behind her, their faith in her carved by the fire she had survived. She did not speak, did not need to. Her presence was enough, her silence carrying more weight than any speech could. The valley behind them would be remembered for the battle, for the bodies, for the victory carved by blood and defiance, but for Alara, it would always be the place where she refused to break when the world demanded it of her. And though her heart still carried the scars of what she had done, she knew now that she could carry them. For in the end she had not been broken under fire. She had become the fire. The end.